We've also got relatively late spread of anatomically modern humans into Central Europe. We've got the Oase Cave in Romania that dates to about 40,000 to 35,000 years ago. That's the skull that's pictured at the top. From this cave, we've got the remains of three individuals that includes a complete mandible and a partial skull. These remains in particular retain some robusticity, but they do show clear presence of a chin and of the canine fossa. The canine fossa is this kind of impression right here above where the root of the canine tooth, the upper canine, is. We also find that when we look at the molecular evidence that Neanderthal DNA comprises about 6 to 9% of the total genome of this particular individual. So this represents likely only 4 to 6 generations, or about 200 years, removed from a Neanderthal ancestor. It doesn't show any close affinity with later modern humans from Europe, so there presumably would have been then some kinds of bottleneck events that happen kind of later in time that may correspond to, for example, some of the ice ages, the glacial periods and the warmer interglacial periods. So, very exciting evidence that we don't put them too far from the point in time where we had an inbreeding event. In Mladek in the Czech Republic, we've got a skull that's pictured on the bottom right here that dates to about 31,000 years ago. There are several crania that are present. They include a fairly large degree of variation. For example, a few of those crania possess big brow ridges. So again, fairly recently, only about 30,000 years ago, we still have some individuals, at least, who possess some traits that are considered more archaic or primitive. In Western Europe, the area of southern France is a fossil treasure trove. We've been studying fossils from France since the mid 1800s. Some of the most well known are the Cro-Magnon, who date to about 28,000 years ago. The Cro-Magnon remains that we have, it's about 8 individuals that were found at a rock shelter in southern France. They are associated with particularly one industry, one type of tool assemblages called the Aurignacian tool assemblage, which is an Upper Paleolithic industry. We'll talk about the tool industries here in a moment. At the Abrigo de Lagar Velho site in Portugal, we've got a child skeleton, and that's what's pictured on the bottom right here. The top skull is a Cro-Magnon skull. The bottom picture is the positioned skeleton of this child that dates to about 24,500 years ago. They show evidence with this burial of Upper Paleolithic tools with grave goods, with red ochre that was presumably used to paint bodies, and with a pierced shell that would have been used as some kind of jewelry. And this individual represents a 4-year-old that has highly mixed anatomical features. Some aspects that are very, very much Neanderthal in expression, some aspects that are very, very much modern human in expression. There are also a few outliers that persist into relatively modern times. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the hobbits or Homo floresiensis. These are tiny humans that inhabited the island of Flores in Indonesia, about 370 miles east of Bali until fairly recent times. And the value that this and Homo naledi give us is they demonstrate that archaic humans that may not be the same species as us versus, this examination of Neanderthals and Denisovans persisted until relatively recently. So even as recently as like 200 to 50,000 years ago, we have populations of different species of hominins still on the planet. The remains of Homo floresiensis date somewhere between about 95 to 13,000 years ago. The tools that we find with these date as far back as about 1 million years ago. So it is possible that this represents a Homo erectus population that made it to the island of Flores and then underwent what's called insular dwarfism. There are really interesting evolutionary forces that face mammals on islands relative to birds and reptiles on islands. This particular population was only about 3 feet tall with a very small skull, around 370 to 417 cubic centimeters. This island included large lizards like Komodo dragons, who would have been potential predators of these dwarfed hominin populations, and other mammal species like dwarf elephants. And so, when we've got these insular situations, one of the reasons that large-bodied mammals often undergo dwarfism is to reduce their metabolic burden. If you're in a very small geographical area, smaller body size, especially if you have an energetically expensive metabolism, which is going to certainly be true of mammals that are warm-blooded, smaller body size helps to reduce your metabolic burden. So by focusing on smaller stature, we're able to reduce the amount of calories that individuals need in a given day. Reptiles don't face this same constraint because they're not trying to maintain their body temperature. In fact, they're cold-blooded and can kind of cope with increases and decreases in their body temperature. And so they are able to then grow to fairly large body size. What we know about Homo floresiensis is that they made stone tools that were more sophisticated than Homo erectus tools. They were demonstrating full blade level technology, and blade level technology is considered the venue of only anatomically modern Homo sapiens. They controlled fire and thusly cooked their food. They may have used small blades that they mounted on wooden shafts that allowed them to hunt elephants. And they were theoretically, and I'll tell you why I say theoretically in a second, wiped out by a volcanic eruption around 12,000 years before present. Interestingly, however, the Nagda people of Central Flores and the Mangari people of West Flores tell stories about the little people who lived in caves until the arrival of the Dutch in the 16th century. So at least folk tales may demonstrate a relic population that survived until, several hundred years ago. The other hominin that persisted until relatively recent time is Homo naledi. Homo naledi hasn't been known about for very long. Only discovered firstly in 2013, big excavation done in 2015-2016 field season. A lot of the work published on Homo naledi in 2016. It was discovered in 2013 in the Rising Star Cave in South Africa. And has been named and such by Lee Berger, who's a paleoanthropologist at the University of South Africa. And Lee Berger is also associated with that find of Australopithecus setiba in 2009 that his son tripped over, and has been for the past decade advocating that there are going to be other early Homo finds or other finds of early hominins in South Africa. Much to the dismay of the camp that really felt like East Africa is where most of hominin evolution what took place. And so Homo naledi appears very primitive in some respects. Okay, so anyway, Lee Berger, yes. So this cave complex called Rising Star Cave in South Africa is pretty extensive and has some areas that are really, really hard to access, including the D. naledi chamber, which is where these Homo naledi fossils were excavated from. And so to get to the D. naledi chamber, there is an area called the Superman's Crawl, which is only about 10 inches high. And there's also the Dragon's Back that you have to climb up. And then the D. naledi shaft itself that goes down into the open kind of cave area is incredibly narrow too. So in order to excavate this, Dr. Berger had to he couldn't fit in there. He put out a call on Facebook saying wanted petite, skinny people with paleoanthropological experience and caving experience. He got about 66 applicants and chose 6 women. So this was a big deal in the sense of paleoanthropology is not a field that's been that's really noted contributions of women. I mean, Mary Leakey, of course, but aside from her, it's been the purvey of male researchers. So not only that, they excavated 1,500 specimens in like a 3-week time period and then basically set up a tent camp outside of the entrance to the cave complex where Dr. Berger brought in a lot of new young researchers, people who had only recently defended their dissertation and got awarded their doctorate, people who maybe even were considered ABD or all but dissertation. And he would set up tables under tents that, like one table was the wrist bone table, one table was the femur table, one table was the crania table, etc., where these massive amounts of skeletal material were placed. And additionally, he then published all the measurements and all the data on open source sites so that anybody who wants to can access the parameters for these Homo naledi skeletal material and do their own analyses. He also put 3D print codes for some parts, including the skull of Homo naledi, so that anybody who wants to 3D print a Homo naledi skull can. Homo naledi appeared very primitive in some respects. He had a tiny brain of about 560 cubic centimeters, ape-like shoulders for climbing, primitive premolar roots. In other ways, though, it strongly resembled modern humans. The molar crowns were very small, and they had 5 cusps on their molars, just like modern humans do. Initially, Dr. Berger was maybe holding out hope that Homo naledi would date to about 2 million years ago and be one of the first members of the genus Homo, but he notes even now that in reality that it wasn't really where his suspicion lay. And so the radioisometric dating techniques have put Homo naledi dating to sometime between 335 and 226,000 years ago. There's been one other cave chamber that has since been excavated that has just as much skeletal material, and this helps to cement Dr. Berger's assertion that maybe these bodies were intentionally buried, maybe not in terms of like a ritual associated with it, but certainly in terms of maybe trying to protect the populations from predators or to protect the bodies from extreme weather and such. So when we look at Homo naledi, we find some features that are distinctly Homo. There's a humanesque skull. Even though the brain case is less than half of modern humans, the shape of the skull is very modern. They've got versatile hands. Their palms, wrists, and thumbs are very human-like, suggesting tool use. They've got long leg bones that are very slender and have the strong muscle attachments that show effective bipedality. They've got slightly curved toes, but aside from that, their feet are nearly indistinguishable from ours. They've got foot arches, which suggest efficient long-distance stride. There are some features that are more primitive. They've got primitive shoulders that are positioned in such a way that would have helped with climbing and hanging. The hip bones flare outward. This is considered a primitive trait. They're shorter front to back than those of modern humans, and they've got long curved fingers that could relate to tree climbing ability. So this is a lot of what then was used to speculate where we should put Homo naledi in our evolutionary family bush, but it's likely that Homo naledi persisted until relatively recent times, only to be displaced then by anatomically modern humans in South Africa. So now that we've talked about kind of the anatomy and the timing of the appearance, we've got to recognize that what are some of the cultural differences between pre-modern humans and modern humans? We already noted that pre-modern humans saw an increase in kind of the complexity in the regional specificity of their toolkits, in kind of the degree to which they would be fully recognized as a quote-unquote cultural creature, right? Homo erectus was arguably the first cultural creature with hafting points to shafts, with cooperative hunting, with nomadic lifestyle covering long distances, with building boats, etc. But pre-moderns took that even a step farther. Well, anatomically modern humans take that just that much farther themselves. The Upper Paleolithic in Europe began around 40,000 years ago. In Europe, we note 5 different industries that are all part of Upper Paleolithic blade toolmaking. These include the Châteaubriand, the Aurignacian, the Gravettian, the Sultrian, and the Magdalenian, with characteristic points and other tool types in each of those traditions. Now, interestingly, there are some tool traditions that are only found in the New World, like the Clovis point and the Folsom point. These are more recent industries. People spread widely over Europe and Asia, living in caves and open-air camps, building large shelters. We find the remains, for example, of mammoth bones around which animal hides would have been stretched. people in Western Europe also had to, or all of Europe and Asia, had to cope with very rapid climate shifts. So we've got the advance of the glaciers and we've got the retreat of the glaciers. The last glacial, the Würm Glacial, retreated for good, let's say, around 12,500 years ago. So you had to be able to innovate to deal with rapidly changing environments. We see an elaboration of increasingly sophisticated technology. This includes new and specialized tools. We see a technique called punch blades, which allows for a more standardized, greater productivity of blade production. We see burins, borers, and knives used to work wood, used for smaller, finer detail work. We see new material being used, including antler and bone. In the Magdalenian period, that is one of the later industries, we see the emergence of the atlatl, which helps us to throw spears farther. It's a spear throwing device. So you dock the spear into the atlatl, and then you have a lever that you kind of throw. And what that does is increases the speed and force at which the atlatl leaves, or at which the spear leaves the atlatl. So it helps us to then develop hunting. Or have the capacity to hunt from farther away, which reduces our mortality rates due to hunting. And then this may feed into eventual bow and arrow technology as well. We also see a proliferation in symbolic representation in the art of the period. This includes Venus figurines. It also includes cave paintings and finely engraved tools. And so here we just have a demonstration of what some of these Upper Paleolithic cave paintings look like. They are often associated with representations of game animals that are really important in their diet. We also have this one cave that shows all these hands. Interestingly, this cave with the handprint, it was demonstrated that the measurements of the hand, the dimensions of the hand are actually probably women's hands versus men's hands, which has influenced the debate over what was the identity of some of these first cave painters. The benefit of Europe in terms of cave painting is that we've got a climate. I mean, we've got an abundance of caves, but we also, because these caves are often underground, we've got preservation from exposure to the elements. I mean, if you're in New Mexico, if you're taking the class here in Albuquerque, you know that here in New Mexico we've got a lot of petroglyphs, but the petroglyphs are exposed to the elements, so they're not as well preserved as some of these cave paintings. And then here we have a picture I took at the American Natural History Museum in New York City that shows some of these early Venus figurines. We've got some from Italy, from Russia, etc. I do, in fact, have another picture that has the Venus of Willendorf, who is like the stereotypic Venus figurine. But these are thought to be symbolic representations of the female form, kind of celebrating fertility, celebrating the power that women have through motherhood. In Africa, we've got early accomplishments in rock art, such as the Apollo 11 rock shelter site that has painted slabs that date to about 28 or 26,000 years ago. We've got the Blombos Cave that has remarkable bone tools, beads, and ochre fragments dating to about 73,000 years ago. We have Pinnacle Point, which has ochre used for personal adornment, the exploitation of shellfish, which then gives us shells that we can use for artwork, and the use of microliths going back to 165,000 years ago. And then Sibiru, that has evidence of the use of adhesives to half stone tools to handles, that also may indicate use of snares and traps that date to around 75,000 or 70,000 years ago. So there's a debate within paleoanthropology of the quote-unquote advent of behavioral modernity, which is this period where humans become not only modern in anatomical organization and anatomical expression, but also modern in cultural expression. And initially it was thought to coincide with modern humans moving into Europe around 40,000 years ago because of the proliferation of cave paintings and sculpture that accompany modern humans moving into Europe. But with these older sites in Africa, particularly places like Pinnacle Point and the Blombos Cave, we're seeing that rather than Europe marking some really special kind of leap that comes with moving into Europe, that just as the anatomical forms of modern Homo sapiens kind of varied in a mosaic pattern and emerged over a longer period of time, so too did the cultural expression of anatomically modern humans. All of these are evidence of what we call a complex cognition, but we've already talked about the fact that Neanderthals produced art. Neanderthals had ritual burials as well. So our definition of behavioral modernity may be it may predispose us to excluding pre-modern hominins, pre-modern humans from that very definition. And so, to summarize the Upper Paleolithic culture, it's the culmination of 2 million years of cultural development. The Upper Paleolithic is characterized by sophisticated cultural and material heights, big game hunting, new weapons, the atlatl, all sorts of things that are that enable us to reduce our mortality while hunting. We see the emergence of needles, tailored clothing, the hafting of tools, burials with elaborate grave goods, which can indicate perhaps a status or dominance hierarchy. We also see the first emergence, going back 30 or 40,000 years, of grinding hard seeds and roots. This is going to then, coupled with the broad spectrum revolution, with the retreat of the last glacial at about 12,500 years ago, this is going to set the stage for domestication of both plants and animals. Now, there's one other alternative that has been published very, very recently that sort of combines single point of origin or replacement theory with multi-regionalism. We did evolve from ancestral hominins in Africa, but we did it in a more complicated fashion, one that involves the whole continent. So there's a cave in Morocco called Jebel Hiroud, which has some 315,000-year-old bones that are the oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens. What this does is pushes back the proposed dawn of our species and adds Northwest Africa to a list of possible origin sites. Prior to this point, most people considered East Africa to be the area where modern Homo sapiens first evolved. The remains from Jebel Irhoud have an odd combination of features. They've got flat faces of modern humans versus their face being kind of pulled forward like we saw with Neanderthals. They have elongated skulls of ancient species like Homo erectus, so their skulls are not round yet. From the front, they would have passed for modern humans. From the side, they would have stood out as looking odd. When we look at the entirety of the fossil record from Africa, we find different combinations of ancestral and modern traits all across Africa. So we have the Floresbad skull from 260,000 years ago in South Africa. We have Omo Kubish from 195,000 years ago in Ethiopia. We have the 160,000-year-old Herto skull also from Ethiopia. And so scientists are starting to treat Africa as a continent instead of a single site in Africa as the potential for the earliest Homo sapiens. I mean, it's a matter of, do we consider these remains separate subspecies or different species altogether? If they are simply separate subspecies, they are all Homo sapiens. And what we see now with present populations is just an incredible loss of diversity. Our species may have been far more diverse than we currently are. Eleanor Scarry, an archaeologist from the University of Oxford, said, if you look at skulls, you'll see different features of modern humans arising in different locations at different times. For that reason, she says, we're a species with multiple African origins. And so this has been dubbed now something that's a combination of replacement and multi-regional evolution, that is African multi-regionalism. So, what's the difference between African multi-regionalism and multi-regionalism as a whole? Well, at least the African populations are a lot closer to each other. So that idea of gene flow between populations feels a bit more plausible with African populations than it does with all of the old world in its entirety. And so in summary, recognize these two main hypotheses, the regional continuity model and the various replacement models. Recognize that DNA evidence with Neanderthals and modern humans indicates periods of interbreeding that support at least a partial replacement model over the complete replacement model. Archaeological finds correspond with this. When we look at kind of this timetable of the appearance of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, we find them first in Africa, maybe as far back, well, if we count the Moroccan skull, as 300,000 years old. If we really only count the Omo Kubish skull, then we're talking about about 200,000 years ago. We also then find modern humans from South Africa 100,000 years ago, Middle East 100,000 years ago, and then later periods of colonization in the rest of the Old World. Also recognize that the Upper Paleolithic is a cultural period that has a lot of innovation, more sophisticated art, very elaborate burials that are rich in grave goods, and that happens both in Eurasia and Africa, indicating kind of the continuity of our species. But we also recognize with Homo floresiensis and Homo naledi that we've got a relatively recent persistence of more archaic forms or forms that we really don't know where to put in relation to fully modern forms. At relatively recent periods of time, we've got a lot of overlap between these archaic populations and anatomically modern humans.